Okay, in this video, we're going to look at ecological succession. And you can ask, what is ecological succession? And this document describes it as the sequential process of rebuilding an ecosystem when a disaster destroys it. And we have primary and secondary ecological succession. And this diagram illustrates ecological succession, where to begin with, in an ecosystem, we'll have annual plants, which get replaced by perennials, then shrubs, then softwood trees, and then hardwood trees. And we have primary succession when uh, an ecosystem forms for the first time. For example, after some lava covers a part of a system, so you get some new rock exposed. So there had been no life on that previously. And then you have secondary succession, for example, after a forest fire. So the old ecosystem is destroyed, but there's some pre-existing, or the soil has been modified, and there might be some roots and so on, and seeds already present in the soil. So life isn't starting from anew, and therefore secondary succession occurs much more rapidly than primary succession. And it relates to this part of the syllabus, explain how ecosystems are self-sustaining. And what we need to look at is refer to ecological succession and climax communities. So, as I said before, what is ecological succession? It's the observed process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over a period of time. So we might expect over a period of time the observed structure of an ecosystem to gradually change. And it says ecosystems are constantly changing, and ecological succession is a gradual process of change and replacement of the type of species in a community. Notice a change and replacement. The idea here, of course, is that some species will outcompete others. Some species will go there and they make it possible for another species to enter, and the new species will outcompete the first species that came there. And each community makes it harder for the previous community to survive. And there are two main types of ecological succession. We have primary succession, which is a process of creating life in an area where no life had existed earlier. For example, after a volcanic eruption. I suppose so sometimes with plate tectonics and so on, an area under the sea might rise up and become a piece of land. It changes from a marine to terrestrial environment. Um, so an example of an area in which a community had never lived before would be a new lava or rock from a volcano that makes a new island. So that would be when organisms start living on that. That would be an example of primary succession. And primary succession begins in a place without any soil, like the sides of volcanoes, landslides, and flooding. Uh, it starts with the arrival of living things such as lichens that do not need any soil to survive. And the first organisms that come to live there were called pioneer species. And that's important. We need to call these pioneer species. That's an important term. Then when the lichens die, they decompose, adding small amounts of organic matter to the rock. And simple plants like mosses and ferns can grow on this new soil. So the lichen modified the environment to make it possible for ferns and mosses to grow there. And the simple plant dies, adding more organic material, so the soil layer thickens, and grasses and other plants begin to take over. So we can notice a gradual change in the type of organisms that live there. And these plants die, and they add more nutrients to the soil, and shrubs and trees can survive on this soil. And then insect, birds, and mammals can now begin to move in. And what was earlier bare rock now supports a variety of life. And that's important. The variety of life will increase over time. And that's a key point. And this again is an example of primary succession, moving from the beach inland. And you have smaller plants, which are the pioneer species. And then you get shrubs and then trees, and a kind of softwood trees like pine wood and so on. And then the trees gradually get stronger and sturdier. And notice the humus content of the soil will also increase. And this is an example of primary succession. Then we have secondary succession, and it's a process of restabilization that follows a disturbance in the area where life has formed an ecosystem. So notice the abiotic factors have in fact been transformed a bit. So you'll have a soil in secondary succession where you didn't have one in primary succession. And secondary succession occurs on the surface where an ecosystem previously existed. It is a process by which one community replaces another community which has been partially or totally destroyed. And it might be by a natural process such as floods or earthquakes, etc. But it also could be by human activities. Humans sometimes will clear a piece of land, and then after that, if they leave it, then gradually over time, natural species will start using that land. So secondary succession then occurs when existing community has been cleared by any type of disturbance. It mentions a fire, cyclone, or hurricane, and the soil remains intact. And the area begins to return to its natural community. If you've ever seen a hurricane, some areas get severely damaged by the hurricane, but then the trees and so on will regrow fairly quickly. And the important point is because these habitats previously supported life, second succession begins, and second succession is going to be far more rapid than primary succession. So you kind of a circle, you have a disturbance, then you have grasses growing, then you have shrubs, then you have small trees, and then you have a climax community. Once you reach a climax, it doesn't change again. So the climax community remains more or less the same. So in ecology, when you reach a climax and you stay there. So why does ecological succession occur? And it's because it is a process of life for plants and other living organisms. because the organisms alter the soil structure and the species and communities constantly change over a period of time. And then succession will continue until the environment reaches its final stage, the climax community. It's climax because it's a final stage, but it stays there. So you have a gradual change. You first have bare rock, then you have lichens, then you have mosses, then herbs and weeds, then grasses, then shrubs and pines, hickories, immature oak, and then finally you have much larger trees and so on. And it occurs over hundreds of years. Okay, how ecological succession takes place. Succession will continue until the environment reaches its final stage, the climax community. And it is a mature, stable community that is the final stage of ecological succession. And this community remains the same throughout the time, if not disturbed. So it's going to stay there. And the stable group of plants and animals, which is the end result of the succession process, does not always mean only big trees. There could be cacti in a desert, or grasses in the fields, like savannas in Africa. So grassland, climate community could be a grassland. The point is it remains in that state and it doesn't really change. So all of those are climax communities. First of all, they have a desert here. Then you have a grassland. This looks like a tropical rainforest. And then you have a pine forest. All of those are climax communities. And there are two main physical factors that determine the nature of the community that develops in an area. First of all, you have temperature, and then you have the amount of rainfall. So remember, you have abiotic factors, which determine the fauna and flora that can live in a certain place. Different organisms are adapted to different conditions. And therefore, the climax community will contain organisms which are adapted to these conditions. So threats to succession. The grasses that move in as pioneer species are often thought as weeds, and the subsequent growth of shrubs are considered undesirable bush, so they'll be cut away, and therefore this prevents the climax community from being achieved. So it says, but without these intermediate stages, the disturbed habitat cannot return to a forest. So you need to have all of those intermediates to reach the climax. So how do humans affect ecological succession? So clearing the land for garden and preparing the soil for plantings is a type of major external event that radically restructures and disrupts a previously stabilized ecosystem. So that land clearance is not terribly good, and it removes the habitat for many organisms and disrupts a natural ecosystem. And disturbance may immediately begin a process of ecological succession. And of course, if it's farmland or garden and so on, the natural process is not allowed to continue. So over a long period of time, the climate conditions of an ecosystem is bound to change. As notice, organisms have an impact on the climate of the surroundings, and the idea of a microclimate. Forests, for example, make the land underneath cooler and damper, and also less light, and therefore change the type of organisms that can live there. And that seems to be the end of this. Okay, so that's where this one will finish. So having said that, we can close up